All right, welcome back to Left Reckoning. Joining us now, Austin Gonzalez of Machete y Mate, a podcast, a revolutionary Marxist podcast emphasizing Latin American politics. He joins us. Austin, hello.
Hello, hello. Happy to be here.
I want to recommend everybody go subscribe to Machete y Mate. It's a sort of there's podcasts that I'll subscribe to and think I'll look out for the episodes that look interesting, and then there's a podcast that I immediately go through the back catalog because it basically, frankly, makes me more competent at my job, and that's what Austin and the guys have at Machete y Mate. So tell us a little bit about the podcast first.
Well, first of all, I appreciate the very kind words. Since we generally don't know what we're doing as far as podcasting, we are three nerds, three people who have followed Latin American politics for our whole lives, right? That is myself, my friend Leroy, who's based in Australia, and my brother T, who is also on the podcast. We are three nerds who have followed Latin American politics our whole lives, and a consistent theme that we've always noticed walking through leftist circles in the United States is how much of a disconnect there can sometimes be between the United States left and the Latin American left. And a lot of that is the language barrier, right? We often talk about on the podcast how so many right-wing politicians in Latin America, or just politicians in Latin America in general, they will present themselves different in English than they do in Spanish with the intention to deceive people. So we found it important to produce English language content for leftists in the United States that analyzes Latin America from a leftist perspective in language, and not just English, but also like human language that a leftist in the United States can understand. And that's been our goal with the podcast. So
yeah, I highly recommend people go check out the current events episodes. That's the ones I've been kind of going through. It really is what you want from a podcast. So great work. One of the issues that might draw people's attention kind of on a drive-by basis to Latin American politics is Puerto Rican independence, or Puerto Rican statehood, I should say, rather. Tell me why that is not actually what the goal that particularly the left should be interested in, and give us your pitch for independence.
Absolutely. So there's a lot to unpack here. I think there's two different things I like to emphasize when I think about the political status of Puerto Rico and how leftists, particularly in the United States, should be orienting themselves toward it, right? I think first and foremost, what people in the United States should be pushing for is a proper and fair self-determination process for Puerto Rico, right? The island has had, I think what, six status referendums at this point. All those referendums are kabuki theater, right? It's literally the ruling statehood party, or whatever party is ruling at the time, putting in bullshit referendums to try and force whatever outcome they want. That's literally what just happened in November. This is why I think an emphasis on a binding status assembly is so crucial in Puerto Rico. So status assembly, what the hell does that even mean, right? The status assembly concept is something that organizers in Puerto Rico have been working on in the last few years. And how this would be structured is essentially as a constitutional convention on the island of Puerto Rico, where Puerto Ricans can decide in a binding process. And that word is key there, binding, because every single referendum that Puerto Ricans have voted on have been non-binding. Every single time. In fact, the most recent one in November, the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice came out and said, yeah, this referendum is almost meaningless and we're not going to listen to the results, right? Because they're non-binding, people don't care, right? Why would they? Why would they? I think making a binding process is crucial, right? Now, that's where I think leftists in the United States should be pushing for in a nuanced way when it comes to Puerto Rico. Myself, as a Puerto Rican, as a member of the Puerto Rican diaspora, as you mentioned, Matt, I'm a full-blown independentista. Not only that, I believe in independence for Puerto Rico and reparations for Puerto Ricans. Now, why do I say that, right? Why do I embrace independence over statehood, and why do I mention reparations for Puerto Ricans as well? There's reasons for that. I tell people all the time, I used to be a statehooder, right? I understand people in the United States who are, progressive or liberal or whatever, and embrace statehood. I used to be one of you, right? Until I learned about the history of Puerto Rico, until I actually learned about the United States' historical suppression of the independence movement, right? Until I learned about during the mid-20th century when the United States sterilized 1/3 of Puerto Rican women, right? Particularly Puerto Rican women of color. Why would they do that, right? Aside from just, being shitty. Well, in an attempt to whiten the island, right? That's another aspect of this extremely corrupt statehood movement. There's a saying on the island of Puerto Rico that the Statehood Party, which their formal title is the New Progressive Party, which there's nothing new or progressive about them. You'll hear that one a lot. But the thing people say about the Statehood Party is that they're essentially a criminal organization. And it is literally good old boys like corrupt politics with the Statehood Party. The Statehood Party's delegate to Congress ran Trump's campaign on the island, is a fervent Trump supporter. People's brains explode when I tell them, oh yeah, there's plenty of Trump supporters in Puerto Rico, right? People always say to me, well, what about the hurricane and the response and everything? Yo, there is a deep self-hatred within the statehood movement in Puerto Rico, right? Within different sectors of the island of Puerto Rico and in Latin America broadly, because of, the white supremacist culture that, we live in the world, right? There is, I think it's just really important to think about kind of going back to independence over statehood, right? I think it's important to look at it from an internationalist perspective as well, right? I think that's really important for socialists. I think a state of Puerto Rico, right? A permanent colonialism is how I would define that. And not just that, but a permanent U.S. base in the Caribbean to do whatever the hell they want to Cuba, to Venezuela. I don't know if people remember during the beginnings of the Guaido push, right? The attempted Venezuelan coup, which I guess they're still attempting apparently. Jesus Christ, Biden, right? Yeah. I remember during the beginnings of that, there was it would be funny if it weren't so sad. There was a moment where the governor of Puerto Rico at the time, he was eventually had to resign in disgrace. That's a whole other thing. He sent like a boat or something like that from the island of Puerto Rico to Caracas to kind of add pressure. Some people might not realize this. Venezuela is the closest continental landmass to Puerto Rico, right? Closer than the United States. Not that they're super close, but relatively speaking, it's closer. And that's an important thing to think about as well when I think about socialists orienting themselves toward Puerto Rican independence. This is not a civil rights issue, right? That's what the Statehood Party and the stateholders will try to say. They'll try to say it's a statehood, they'll try to say it's a civil rights issue, which DC statehood most certainly is a civil rights issue. Puerto Rico, this is a human rights issue, right? This is about international law. Every year, the UN's decolonization committee puts out a report saying, hey, yeah, it's kind of fucked up what's happening in Puerto Rico. We should probably give them independence or something. And every year the United States ignores it. So once again, I think internationalism is a big aspect of that. And that's why I got the black flag behind me as well, because I'm a bleeding heart independentista. So.
Well, could I ask you too, in the divisions between, people who are pushing for independence versus statehood, is there a class analysis there that you're able to make? Or is it sort of divided equally amongst working class and wealthier people in Puerto Rico?
It depends. It's complicated. I would say you would find it it's very wide ranging among the sectors, right? I'd say the Statehood Party definitely has the political machines in Puerto Rico, so to speak, behind them, or I guess they themselves are a political machine in San Juan. Like the political elites, I guess is more the phrase I'm looking for, right? There were political dynasties and shit like that. I think there is certainly a base of working class support for statehood in Puerto Rico. And one of the biggest reasons for that is, well, there's a couple of reasons. One, the historical suppression of the independence movement. I think it's impossible to talk about the prominence of the statehood, or I think it's possible to talk about the power that the statehood movement has in Puerto Rico without talking about the intentional suppression of the independence movement that happened in the last 100 years. Even just in our lifetimes, it was 2005 that Filiberto Ojeda Rios, who was the leader of the Puerto Rican independence guerrilla movement at the time, was just killed by the FBI in his house when he was doing nothing. And it was a big controversy at the time. So things like that still happen. But yes, another reason that there's working class support for both independence and statehood in Puerto Rico is I go back to that self-hatred, right? This idea that, oh, come on, we're Puerto Ricans. Us running a country, we can't do that. We need the United States. Come on, they're going to give us the economic benefits. I would say, to talk to Michigan and Mississippi about how that's worked out for them.
We were
right?
just talking about that, yeah.
Exactly. Ask them about the benefits of statehood, right? I, of course, favor not only independence, but Caribbean integration, right? I don't it blows my mind that you can't just take a ferry from San Juan to Santiago, Cuba. That's literally against the laws of nature in my mind, that you can't do that. That's mind-boggling to me. So yeah, I hope that answered the question.
No, that's great. I mean, I think that Caribbean integration angle sounds also interesting because it seems like for something like independence and reparations, it would need to be along with some of the other like area Caribbean states. I mean, Latin America in general. But yeah, I mean, I even talk a little bit about Caribbean integration, maybe.
Absolutely. So Cuba in particular, I should start with Cuba and Puerto Rico. Cuba and Puerto Rico have strong, deep historical and cultural ties. Now, why is that, right? Aside from just being in Spanish-speaking, nations in the Caribbean. Well, for any of my history nerds out there, Cuba and Puerto Rico remained colonies longer than all the others, right? Up until 1898, when the United States annexed Puerto Rico and essentially turned Cuba into a protectorate with things like the Platt Amendment, right? At that point, Cuba and Puerto Rico functionally, they were like the same country, right? They were both like they were the last outposts of the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean. So there's deep ties there. There's a saying that Cuba and Puerto Rico are two wings of the same bird, right? That's kind of like a saying that leftists use in Cuba and Puerto Rico. There's a great Fidel Castro quote that I love to use, right? Which is something to the effect of, as long as there's one Puerto Rican that supports independence, it's a moral duty for us to support it as well, something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of an example of the deep ties between Cubans and Puerto Ricans. But more broadly, I'd say my like ideological father when I think about Puerto Rican politics, and I think you'll hear this from a lot of modern day independentistas, is a man named Eugenio Maria de Hostos, right? He was a famous Puerto Rican educator. He had in during like the late 19th century, right up and to the U.S. annexation of the island. Hostos really pushed the idea of what he called an Antillean Confederation, right? Basically a united Caribbean. Hostos was a prominent educator, not just in Puerto Rico. He did a lot of work in the Dominican Republic, did a lot of work in Chile as well, I believe. And one of my favorite things about Hostos, right? Because he did so much in the work in the Dominican Republic, when he died, he said, "I want my bones buried in Santo Domingo until Puerto Rico is free. Then I want my bones transferred back to Puerto Rico."
Wow.
So to this day, one of Puerto Rico's most famous historical figures is buried in the Dominican Republic. So there's deep ties across the Caribbean. It's once again, what makes me even more mad, like with everything that's going on in Haiti, I know the president of the Dominican Republic, Luis Abinader, was talking about oh, maybe we should do a border wall. Like, Jesus, what the Caribbean needs is less border. What the world needs is less borders, right? Less borders, less border walls.